Lloyd Divine.
Okay. So, how's everybody doing? From what it sounds like, everybody's struggling to keep warm. We got down to -10 a couple of days ago. Now we're in a heat wave. We're currently at 32. So we can't complain about that. So tonight we're talking about relationships with some of the other tribes and looking at who is friend and who is foe. And for us, we'll find out here in just a little bit that our friend list was pretty short. We didn't have too many of our fellow tribes that we didn't have issues with. And even those that were considered friends, we might find out that we had a few issues even with them. But our objectives is to determine who was a friend and who was a foe. And we're looking at relationships that go back before comfortably 1850. I think one of the latest dates I have on here is about the mid 1840s. But most of these relationships go back prior to our leaving Ohio and Michigan. Because of time, we can't discuss about everything that's happened for the last 350 years. But we're going to determine who was friend and foe, who was our best friends, and who was our worst enemies. And I want to close with just a couple of quotes on the Americans. Because ultimately, it was the Americans that did us more harm than basically all the other nations combined. And a couple of quotes that I've found over the years that kind of impress that pretty clearly. Our friend list, kind of short: Delaware, Shawnee, Miami, Peoria. It just doesn't get much longer than this. The three Illinois nations, part of the Illinois Confederacy, if you will. There's one that we'll see is on the list that was one of our foes, but the Illinois nations basically were aligned along with the Miami, and the Miami were one of our best friends. And of course, the Huron of Lorette, the Wyandottes, they were one of the nations that we never, ever rose up against, nor did we ever consider fighting against our cousins there. Now, I've been talking all day. I just got off work about 30 minutes ago now, so I'm going to be sipping on my tea. So hopefully I won't be cracking up too much here. This is our foe list. And what I want to do for sake of time is maybe spend no more than 10 minutes on each one of these nations and discuss the good and the bad with each. Not going to get anything from Kim on that. Nah, okay. But this is our short list of the foes that we had. And you can see on the far left side of the screen, every single one of those nations there are our cousins. They're all Iroquoian nations. And some of our worst enemies that we had to fight against were our own blood cousins. And we will determine pretty quick which one of those of the foes that we have here is the worst enemy that we had fought against. So jumping right into it, let's determine, first of all, who was our best friend. And what I have done is try to hide the name of the nation that I'm talking about here to see if everybody can figure out who this nation is that we're discussing. And our greatest friend that we had goes back to the days of ancient time, all the way back to when the Great Island was basically traversed through the Trail of the Snake. We met up with a nation that became almost inseparable with us. And with our oral traditions and a combination of their oral traditions, we can see that we were aligned against the Allegwe back in the early days of the Great Island. And the Allegwe were actually vassals of the Stone Giants, the mound builders. And as we traversed the Great Island, we actually had some battles as mentioned in our oral traditions, as well as this nation's oral traditions about fighting against the stone giants. In our relationship with this nation, we refer to them as our nephews. And when you find out here in a bit who this nation is, it doesn't really make much sense how we could refer to this nation as our nephews because of the interesting relationship that they have with us. And William Walker Jr. tried to explain in one of his stories with Mr. Draper how that relationship of nephew came about. And William was talking about how in the early days of our history, we had a sachem who had a sister, and this sister became pregnant, but unfortunately nobody knew who the father was of her child. So this kind of upset the sachem, and he decided to take his sister and basically isolate her from the rest of the nation. Nobody was to have any interaction with her. Nobody was to come into her presence. They couldn't see her, nothing. She was completely isolated except for one individual that was there to provide for her needs, if she had any that she could not provide for herself. When she finally gave birth, she was not allowed to let that child interact with anybody. And over a short amount of time, this woman began to speak a different language that nobody knew about. And over a great sense of time, she had developed this language that was unknown to anybody very fluently. And when the child had become of age, her brother decided to go ahead and let her come back into the nation. And whenever she came back into the nation, she took a mate from among the people, which connected her back to her own given people. But the problem was nobody knew the language that she was speaking and her child was speaking. So they kind of stuck to themselves, her and her new family, and they created this new nation of people that spoke a totally different language. So this nation actually came out of our peoples, or so William wants to explain. And our traditions that we have don't always have to match up with documented history, nor does it have to match up with science. That's what's so valuable about our traditions, is sometimes they defy science and they explain things that science really has a hard time explaining. But this nation eventually, once we kind of separated, went our own paths, became a subservient nation to the Iroquois Confederacy. And ultimately, they ended up losing all of their land that was granted to them by the Good Twin. Their bestowed land was lost. They were homeless. And we ended up providing them land in Ohio, in the Ohio country. And by the time that we were removed from Ohio, we found ourselves without a place to call home in the Indian Territory. And they ended up returning the favor to us. And they gave us land out of honor to their uncles for the land that we provided to them in Ohio. So that should be a dead giveaway who our greatest friend ever within our recorded history was. Can somebody tell me who this nation is that we're talking about?
The Delaware.
The Delaware, the Lenape. They are and have been from the very beginning of time our most trusted and closest friend of all the nations, without question. So this next quote here, I won't take the time to read all of it. When you get the PDF of it, you can take the time and read it, but this is just a feast of a lot of grief. It's talking about one of the chiefs shortly after our dispersal, describing what happened to them by our greatest foe. Our greatest enemy was brutal. And I must say that we were likewise brutal back to our greatest enemy. But when you get a chance, just read that over. And it's very sad to see what level of brutality was inflicted when we actually began to fight during the Beaver Wars. But this nation here is referred to as our cousin. And that relationship also goes back to the beginning of time. the closest of friends, they were no less a friend at one point in time as equal to the Lenni Lenape. But unfortunately, a blood feud came between us and them. And in that blood feud, the absolute sheer destruction that was rained down upon the great island just became horrid. And the relatives of some of our closest relatives from the Quebec area, or not Quebec area, but the Ontario area.
Because I'm,
Do what? But some of our closest relatives in the Ontario area were taken captive by this nation, and they were adopted into their nation and were forced to fight against their blood relatives. Some of them were fighting against brothers, sisters, aunts, and uncles, and they were forced into a sense of bondage and captivity. And that bondage and captivity remained for almost 100 years. The nation here, our greatest enemy, once they could not adopt us into their nation, they decided that the only recourse they had was absolute total destruction of our people. So they sought and fought hard to kill us. At all costs, they wanted to try and destroy every single one of us that remained. And they eventually became a relatively close friend to us through the maneuvering of the British. They were trying to coerce our defection away from the French. And at one point in time, Nicholas actually had made some arrangements for us to be adopted into their League of Nations. And that didn't quite work out as Nicholas wanted, because they were not going to allow us to become an equal to them. So we were barred from joining their league. And unless we were willing to submit to adoption, we could have no part of their league. And this nation, of all the nations out there, probably caused more deaths among our ancestors than any other tribe. Does anybody want to take a guess who this nation is?
The Seneca.
The Seneca, you are correct. The Seneca Nation has caused probably more deaths among our people than any other tribe. And they had at one point in time requested that we join their league through the efforts of Nicholas and what he had done to try and fix a lot of those long-term standing feuds that existed for 100 years. So moving on, we'll take a look at our narcissistic friend. Sometimes we have friends that we just struggle to be friends with because it's an uncomfortable relationship. And this friend here that we're going to talk about actually stood up for us. And we won't take the time to read this quote again, but it's through the efforts of this friend after our initial dispersal from the Ontario homelands that we were actually able to gain some protection. So we began to align with them. They were initially an old trade friend of ours that goes back for no telling how many centuries. And they were very frequent guests within the longhouse. They had the ability to come and go into our longhouses just as though they were part of the family. They were that close to us. And when they brought us into another league, they basically stood at our side and vouched for us to say that we would not be disloyal to them. The problem was this nation would go out and pick a lot of fights with some of their enemies. And this nation would come to us basically in a sense of dependency and use our warriors as basically their special forces. They would take our warriors, they would put them out on the battlefield, and because of the loss of a lot of our warriors' lives, we became very uncomfortable with this relationship. And that near state of vassalage that they put us in became so depressing, it became so oppressive that in 1706, we rebelled against this nation as we stood up to defend the Miami people at Fort Detroit. And in 1706, we won our freedom from this nation. We no longer would bow down to their beck and call. And again, in 1738, we had to reaffirm our independence when, again, we came to the rescue, if you will, of another one of our friends that we had just made peace with. We had an ongoing feud with the Flathead people. And knowing where our homeland is and knowing where the homeland of the Flatheads are, you can see that we actually traveled great distances at times to fight with some of our enemies. But we had just made peace with the Flathead. This nation declared war on the Flathead and asked us to come and join them against our newfound friend. We told them, ain't gonna happen. And we basically decided to take the side of the Flathead. We went and fought with them against this friend of ours. And the only way that our friend knew that we were there is they identified our war cry. If it had not been for the identification of our war cry, they would not have known that we were there betraying them, as so they wanted to believe. And it was the raspy war cry of the Raven that was a dead giveaway that we were there fighting for the Flathead. And because of this, we were very divided during Pontiac's War of 1763 and 1766. Some of the nation wanted to stand with Pontiac and some did not. So who can tell me which nation did Pontiac? Who was he chief of?
Shawnee?
No.
No, I'm trying to.
The Ottawa.
The Ottawa. The Ottawa tribe were our narcissistic friend. They tried to persuade us and they gaslighted us and they did all kinds of things to try and keep us aligned to their needs, basically for warriors, for almost 70 years. And when we finally broke away from them, we were never, ever bound to another nation again. Again, another little quote that we won't take the time to read. And you can just read this and look at all of the references to it. Plus at the end, you can see the sources and just dig through some of this stuff. It's pretty good. Our next friend is the underestimated foe, the underestimated friend. And shortly after our dispersal from Ontario, we were chased by the Seneca, basically way out into the wilderness of the Wisconsin country. And this nation, we had known of their existence, but we didn't have a long-term relationship with them other than through just passing of acquaintance. But in 1655, we actually made a long-term acquaintance with them, and they were impressed with our ancestors because we had implements of iron. We had knives and we had axes and tomahawks, and the thing that made them think that we were gods was we had rifles. We had a few rifles that we had obtained from the French, and they were just like consumed with this awe of who we were. And our good friends at the time, the Ottawa, were just sickened by these people. They had severe disdain for them because they thought that they were weak. They thought that they were just weak people in morals. They were also living in the Stone Age. They had flint arrowheads. They were just worthless people. They were just barbarians. So the Ottawa declared war on them, thinking, hey, we can take the land. They needed some land to stay. We needed some land, so they attacked this nation. And we got spanked pretty hard. We had to end up going to the confluence of the Mississippi and Black Rivers, where we basically stayed in protection away from this nation. But unfortunately, in 1672, we declared war on this nation with 100 of our warriors. We took 100 warriors and were absolutely surprised to find out that they sent 3,000 of their warriors against our 100. Only one of our warriors survived. They allowed him to survive to go back and say, we need to leave. Because of this, we ended up being driven out of the Wisconsin country to Mackinac Island. And at that time, it's estimated that we had only 380 citizens. We were almost completely destroyed by the time we left the Wisconsin country. For the next several generations, we had skirmishes that had been ongoing with this nation. And finally, in 1847, the Winnebago and Potawatomi nations came and asked us to join in league with them against this nation. They had been out on the prairie. They had had problems with this nation. They needed to go and basically teach them a lesson. They wanted us to go with them because we knew that we'd been enemies with them for quite some time, but we refused. And the reason that we refused, we'll talk about here in just a moment. So who is this nation that was our underestimated foe?
The Lakota and Dakota.
Right. Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, the Sioux people. And even to this day, the Sioux remember our little pillages that we had back into their domain. They don't know us as the Wyandotte. They know us then as the Huron. And if you ask any of the Sioux people about what took place in the mid to late 1600s, they will remember the skirmishes of the Huron against their people. And enduring foe. This is one of our enemies that we actually were quite impressed with. They were a hardened and respected enemy. They were so respected by our grandmas and grandpas that they eventually adopted a number of these citizens of this nation into our nation and created a whole new clan. The adopted individuals from this nation initially consisted of the Snake Clan, and the Snake Clan is considered our newest clan of all the clans that we have. There were ongoing blood feuds and all-out war that seemed to be never ceasing. It was just a constant battle with this nation. To what the Seneca were in the East, this nation was equal to them in the West, although they don't have the power that the Seneca possessed, but they were just that constant antagonistic foe that we just couldn't shake. In 1712, everything kind of came into a big wow event. This nation, along with another, laid siege to Detroit. And one of the reasons that we were brought to Detroit by the French was for this reason right here, to help defend Detroit from some of the other nations that weren't as friendly with them as what we were. This nation was allied with the British. The British were starting to move out west and started making friends among some of these tribes that didn't have much to do with the nations out on the East Coast. But an alliance was made between the Huron, the Wyandotte, the Chippewa, Mississauga, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. And that alliance right there is where we became the keepers of the Council Fire. That, without the exception of the Mississauga, the Chippewa, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Huron became the Lakes Confederacy, and they defeated the Iroquois Confederacy. But our diplomatic prowess and our ability to go out there among the nations and put our diplomats into their councils aligned an incredible army against these two nations. The Illinois came to fight. The Missouri sent their warriors. The Osage, the Sauk, the Menominee sent their warriors to this alliance, and that has all contributed to the power of our diplomats that went out and brought in this massive alliance against these two nations. After a 23-day siege, these two tribes, not the tribes in whole, but those that were laying siege to Detroit, were utterly destroyed. Every single one that had come to fight the French were killed. Some of the nations wanted to go ahead and let them return back to their people, but our chiefs at the time said, they're all going to die for being that brazen in laying siege to Detroit. In 1848, the Northwest Confederacy was reassembled in Indian Territory. And during one of our assemblages there, this nation was in attendance. They were not part of the Northwest Confederacy, but they had been granted land just a little to the north of where we bought our land from the Delaware. During this council meeting of the Confederacy, a wampum belt was brought out by some of our leaders. This wampum belt had a red tomahawk that was right in the middle of it. This nation knew what that wampum belt meant with the red tomahawk. They were reminded that war had never been settled among our people and theirs. And where we were asked by the who was it that asked us? I just had a blank. The Winnebago and Potawatomi, when they asked us to come fight the Sioux, we couldn't go help them because we were right in that almost area of declaring war upon this nation, our longest and most enduring foe. And to this day, we technically have not settled peace with them. Does anybody know who this nation is? Which nation initially made our snake clan? Anybody want to take a guess? Meskwaki.
The Fox. Yep.
The Fox. Our grandmas and grandpas were just enamored by the ferocity that their warriors had. There was no other warriors out there that equaled the ferocity of ours other than the Meskwaki. We were just impressed with the way they fought. And because of that, we adopted their people into ours, and they became us, and they became our snake clan. A very befitting clan for the Meskwaki people. Another little quote here that we won't take the time to read. Actually, I think we will, because this is a very important quote. This is actually a closing passage at the end of our Treaty of 1789. And if any of you actually go out there and do much research on our history, you will find that over the last 130 years, our name has almost been erased from the books that are written today. Our name has been replaced by the Shawnee for a lot of the things that we had accomplished during the American Revolution, the War of 1812. And a lot of people forget that we actually owned a significant part of the Ohio country. The Shawnee came in because we gave them land. The Delaware came into the Ohio country because we gave them land. And the history books have totally forgotten that. But if you go back to the Treaty of 1789 and you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the treaty, you will find that our chiefs were determined to put a closing clause to that treaty to make everybody remember that we gave the Shawnee their land and that they had no right to give it away. And that right there is enduring proof that the Ohio country was ours. And a lot of the credit that is given to the Shawnee was ours, because what we did was incredible in standing against the Americans, and they didn't like that. So the best way to take care of your enemy is to erase them from history. Okay. A quote here talking about the Americans. This is something a lot of people don't think about as well. The British are the ones that caused the Europeans, of the European nations, they're the ones that caused us the greatest harm. The British and the Americans were back then one and the same. The Americans were nothing but the continuation of British policy that had been initiated from the very days of when the British came to North America. The continuation of the British policies followed into this new nation called the United States. And Sir George Peckham, in a book that he wrote for the king, made this comment right here in 1583 or thereabout. That's when the book was published. But what he said right here set the tone of European policy primarily from the British perspective. And I'm just going to read it because this says a lot, and it sets the tone for what the British did to all the nations. For from the first beginning of the creation of the world, and from the renewing of the same after Noah's flood, all men have agreed that no violence should be afforded to ambassadors, that the sea with his havens should be common, that such as should fortune to be taken in war should be servants or slaves, and that strangers should not be driven away from the place or country whereunto they do come. So that became British policy. Any of the nations that they basically overcome became their servants and their slaves. And that policy moved onward into the new nation that was formed in North America, the United States. So from the British, then on to the Americans, the continuation of this just got worse. When I first read this quote several years ago, it blew my mind. I had to sit there and reread it over and over and over again, especially when you know who the individual was that spoke this. And this is Henry Breckinridge from his book that he published in 1782. From hence, they will see that the nature of an Indian is fierce and cruel, and that an exportation of them would be useful to the world and honorable to those who can effect it. This becomes even more powerful when you know to which nation, to which specific Indian nation Breckinridge was referring to. This was written, the narratives, the actual book is listed over there in the sources, but this was written shortly after Crawford's burning of the stake. And what Breckinridge was talking about here, the exportation of them, he was referring to our grandmas and grandpas. He wanted somebody to go out into the Ohio country and kill the Wyandotte people, all of them. To remove them from the face of the earth would be the most noble deed that anybody could do. He wrote that about our ancestors, and that just blew my mind to know that there was so much hate by an individual who was a lifelong student of divinity. He was an army chaplain during the U.S. Revolution, and in 1799, this man with the philosophy that he had was appointed to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And that became cancerous. And that eventually led up to the policy of removal. And all of us are way too aware of what is happening there. And if anybody, and that's it, there's the sources, that's all. And if anybody hasn't been watching the spinoff on the show Yellowstone, what is it, 1923 or something like that? Has anybody been watching that? Sorry for this quick little thing here, but this is tying in a little bit with that final quote. If nobody has been watching the spinoff to Yellowstone 1923 or whatever the title of it is, they are actually showing what took place among some of the boarding schools. They are showing what they did to some of our young women. These nuns that they are portraying in here in relation to especially one of the young women, I think she might be Flathead, Blackfoot or something. They haven't really disclosed the nation, but you need to see it. It's rough. And this is being presented to the world now, and it's one of the most popular series that's ever been done. People are finally seeing what they did to our kids. And yeah, you just can't hardly sit there and watch it, but yeah, watch it if you can.
I thought the first episode was pretty tame to what I expected, but then this last Sunday's episode, it was horrible to watch it. But I think she is going to filter down to Rainwater, the one in Yellowstone, the chief in Yellowstone.
Yeah, they're setting that up for her to become a very, very, very influential and powerful ancestor of one of the characters in Yellowstone. It's probably Rainwater. But to actually watch it, to see how they are portraying the brutality that was inflicted upon our ancestors, regardless of the nation, it's horrific to watch. And people are finally seeing what took place.
Yeah. I've been reading comments.
I have the same question as Sid, is where is this being shown?
It's on Paramount Plus. I think it's Paramount.
Yes.
Paramount Plus.
Probably not over the airways, huh?
No, unfortunately, it's not.
Actually, is it being shown after Yellowstone on just the regular Paramount
I don't
station
think
on
it is.
Sundays?
I don't think it
Not
is
yet.
Not yet. Until the first season is done, I don't think they'll release it down to Paramount.
Well, no, but they were after Yellowstone, they would be showing like a few episodes of the new shows that were coming out on Paramount Plus. Like they did that on 1883. They did it on Tulsa King, Mayor of Kingston. So I didn't know if they were doing that on
Yeah, I haven't seen any of them yet, but it'd be nice if they do, so it can catch the attention of a lot of people worldwide.
mm-hmm.
Okay, we kind of took a quick little bunny trail there, but I just want to make sure that you guys have a chance to see that, because it just reiterates the horrific crimes that were done. It's hard to watch. Just be prepared. It's very hard to watch. So, does anybody have any questions about any of the nations, friend or foe? You'll see up there the listing of the nations that we were foe with, but just know that there were many, many, many more. These are some of the more prominent names that you can find information on what took place between us and them in history. Any questions? Any comments?
I had a question about the Seneca.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, they're our neighbors now, at least part of them.
Yes and
It
no.
has, yes and no. And that's what I'm trying to understand. Because I understand, when I was reading some material, I think some of your material, that at some point they also helped us, at
Yeah.
least in Oklahoma. So
Well,
what would you consider their status now?
Well, if you look right down here, the very last name on the left column of all the Iroquois nations that we fought with, I list the Mingo. And the Mingo, for a lot of people, is a derogatory name, kind of like what Huron is, but we are Huron. We can never move past that name. It's a part of who we will be for eternity. But the Mingo, I also have in parentheses the Seneca. The Mingo basically were our direct relations from within the neutral Confederacy that were taken captive once the neutral Confederacy collapsed in 1652. When the neutral Confederacy collapsed, the Seneca nation claimed them as their people, and they brought them into what was Eastern, or what would become Eastern Pennsylvania, and they established them as a subservient nation to the Seneca and gave them their name, Seneca. They would not let them identify themselves as a sovereign nation. They wouldn't let them form any sort of government for themselves. They were absolutely, completely subservient to the Seneca people. They carried their name, but they were the captives that came out of the neutral Confederacy. In time, the Seneca became embroiled with a lot of the politics that took place with the British and the Americans, and they began to lose a lot of their control over the Seneca in Eastern Pennsylvania. They began to self-identify themselves as Mingo, and that is a corruption of Magua, which is what the Delaware, the Lenape, called the Iroquois people. And it became corrupted by the Americans into Mingo. The Mingo, eventually, when they were removed from Ohio, were moved to Indian Territory, Northeast Oklahoma, and they took upon the name Seneca for themselves. They set aside Mingo, and they claimed the name Seneca, because now they were far removed from the Seneca proper in New York that they could stand alone with their own self-identity. And the Seneca are not Seneca proper. They are actually neutral Confederacy citizens that were adopted into the Seneca people. And because of that, they are probably our closest, next to the Wyandottes, they are our closest living relatives. And when the Cayuga came down and basically moved to Northeast Oklahoma, Indian Territory, to retain a lot of their traditions, they just intermingled with the Seneca. They became a single nation. The Cayuga enriched their heritage. They began to speak more Cayuga than the native language of the Seneca. And that's when they joined together and became the Seneca Cayuga. But the Seneca is not Seneca proper. It's our old relatives from Ontario, not upstate New York.
Thank you. That was great.
Lloyd, would that be part of the Sandusky Seneca?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Yeah, primarily Sandusky Seneca. They make up a lot of the who is today the Seneca Cayuga.
Right.
I know that what you did tonight is very good, and you're limited on time. And yeah, whenever you did say you're going to talk about 10 minutes each one, I was like trying to count them really fast. I'm like, what?
I was
then I
hoping to get
realized
more of a
he was-
reaction.
He's just trying to get me riled up. But
Yeah.
I think it's also good to realize that today we do have good working relationship with many of these that are
Absolutely.
on the foes list. Ottawa's, like the second chief of the Ottawas and we've done a few presentations during Native American Heritage Month, and we work together. She's asked for our help. She has seen how our gathering of little turtles has worked, and she wants help on doing something with them. We've worked with the Seneca Cayugas. We work closely with the Shawnees. The Miamis, they've been coming over to our cultural center and they've invited us over to theirs. So there's a lot of good working relationships now with these people that what we're doing today will be part of history one day, and it will show that those people are no longer our foes, but we work together.
And I hope everybody, when they listen to the video, watch it and all that, they do understand that a lot of the things that we were talking about here are preceding 1850, because a lot of things began to change after we got into Indian territory that became Oklahoma. A lot of those old relationships were mended. A lot of those old animosities were just set aside and things changed. And I'm going to do something here that might question a little bit, but sometimes some of our worst enemies happen right at home. Okay. So we shouldn't look out there at a lot of these other nations and put a lot of condemnation on them. We need to, when we point at one nation, look back at the other fingers that are pointing right back to us. We've had our own little problems within our own nation. History is littered with our little own internal spats. And I must say that we have reached a point in time where it has never been better among the Wyandotte people. We have reached a point in which we are good friends among ourselves and to ourselves. And if we can't be friends to ourselves, how can we ever be friends to anybody else?
Absolutely.
So don't point at a finger in any of the directions of any of these nations, because we have our own problems. Well,
Yeah.
we have had our own problems. So any more questions?
I'm going to stop the recording, but hold on.